Well, hello there. This is New Mexico History in 10 minutes. I'm Rob Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. By 1912, we were a state of the Union. Shortly after, Arizona became a state, so we were one of the 48 United States of America. It would be about 35 more years until Alaska and Hawaii would come into the fold and make it a nice round 50. But 1912, we were one of the United States of America. Or were we? Yes, officially, ideally, we had joined the Union, the United States, and yet New Mexico was a world unto itself. There's a reason, and it's a reason people still love this place and love coming here, because it's a vital mix of different peoples who are tenacious in their pride and clinging to their cultural ways from centuries before and are still with us. The Pueblo people in 1912 were surviving and thriving in the face of another colonial power taking over them. What made New Mexico unique compared to other states in the region were places like Texas and California had been overwhelmed by Americans starting in the 1840s and 1850s, so that the local populations, the local Mexican people, were a minority. So they were kind of under the rule of the Americans, essentially. New Mexico had a lot of Americans coming over the Santa Fe Trail starting in the 1820s and 1830s. But even by 1900, the numbers were not as high in those other states. New Mexico always had a bit of a balance of power between the Mexican Hispano Nuevo Mexicanos on the one hand, and then white Americans on the other. So culturally, politically, in all ways, the local culture was always very strong and still is. New Mexicans embraced being American to a point, but they also still embraced their old ways. Outwardly, very proud of being American, very proud to serve the new country. New Mexicans sent many of their sons and then later daughters to help the United States fight in foreign wars. We'll see later on with the two world wars and other conflicts around the world that the United States got into. But back home, they were still Mexican, speaking their unique Spanish, a blend of Spanish from Spain, Spanish from Mexico, mixed in with Nahua Mexican Indian words and Puebloan and Genízaro words and pronunciation, and then American words, English words making their way into the local Spanish, but still speaking Spanish at home. They weren't allowed to speak Spanish at school because there were attempts to force assimilation on the New Mexicans, including the native peoples, the Puebloan and Navajo, Apache people, forbidding them from speaking their languages. But they did it at home, and they did it with friends and family, and the languages are still with us. They would practice their art ways, the santos, carvings, paintings, music, singing Mexican songs and alabados and alabanzas and inditas, and foodways, which are still with us. This was very similar to what the Pueblo people did in the face of forced Spanish assimilation in the 1600s and 1700s, hanging on to their languages and their foodways and cultural and religious expressions. Again, go back to Spain, and you see the Sephardic Jews and the Muslim Moors doing the same thing when they were forced to convert to Catholicism and become Spanish Catholics. Outwardly, they would do that to belong to the greater dominant society, but then would go home and practice their own cultural ways. It's natural. It's what human beings do. So this was New Mexico in the early 1900s, starting to flourish economically. The populations are also starting to mix. It wasn't all that separate. Sometimes we think that there's white Americans on one side and Hispanic New Mexicans on the other. There was a lot of blending going on even in the 1800s and continuing into the 1900s. So by the time we get to, say, 1915 to 1920, what we start to see is a movement with women in New Mexico to start to fight for the vote. The New Mexicans were granted citizenship in the mid 1800s. No tests were required. They didn't have to learn English. They were just given amnesty and granted citizenship and voting power eventually with statehood. But the women still didn't have the vote. And in New Mexico, this was a slow going process for a lot of reasons. The Catholic Church had a big influence in New Mexico since the 1600s and was slow to accept women's rights at certain levels, such as supporting, in New Mexico, supporting women's voting rights. But there were women in the Protestant churches that were coming to New Mexico in the 1800s and into the 1900s that were very influential in trying to get not just Protestant women to vote, but Catholic women as well. Nina Otero Warren, Adelina Otero was from the area around Los Lunas. Her family were wealthy in that area and also very strong politically. Her father and a grandfather before her were politicos, very much involved in the local government and the local economy. So she was a very intelligent and astute person. She was a business person. She was an educator, a writer, and a suffragist. She helped women in New Mexico get the vote by using pamphlets and documents in the Spanish language. And this also helped not just Hispanic women get on board to get themselves the vote, but it also got some of the local Hispano men involved in the movement as well. So the result is by 1920, women get the vote in New Mexico. This is important because what we start to see is democracy at work in a place, New Mexico, where there was very limited, if any, participation in government, say, before the year 1821 or even 1846. There was some limited involvement with local politicians in the Mexican government. But it's really when we get statehood and in the 20th century that New Mexicans start to participate in this great experiment, the United States of America. Interestingly enough, Native Americans would not get the vote. And it would take another, 28 years for the native peoples of New Mexico to get the vote. And we have to look at a man named Miguel Trujillo. He was from Isleta Pueblo, just south of Albuquerque. He had served his country in World War II, as did many Native American New Mexicans. The Navajo code talkers were instrumental in helping the United States defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. The Japanese could crack our code if we had a secret code in English or in any other European language, but Diné, the language of the Navajo, was a secret weapon that the United States could use and used to defeat the Japanese. And it's quite interesting because they were not allowed, the Navajo, to speak their native language in their schools, but by the 1940s, what was considered a negative on the part of the Americans all of a sudden became a real positive. So these folks, the Navajo, were serving the United States. So were the Apaches and the Pueblo people. Yet they did not have representation or the vote in the government that they were helping to protect and fight for. So Miguel Trujillo sued the federal government in 1948 and finally got the vote for the Native American people of New Mexico. So these are some of the strands of history that are starting to tie New Mexico up into being one of the 50 United States of the USA. Stay tuned. I'll be talking about New Mexico in the world wars and our role in the space age. Take it easy. Hasta pronto. Bye.